Today, I started a new novel, and I was reminded once again of just how hard beginnings can be. So let's talk about it. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I like to make YouTube videos, and we are so close to 1,000 subscribers. Do me a favor and subscribe to the channel so that YouTube likes us. Also, if you can like the video, that would be a huge help in the algorithm. And also, leave a comment down below letting me know what sorts of topics you would like me to cover in the future. But let's get into our actual topic today, beginnings. Like I said, I just started a new story, and it got me thinking, how should I begin this book? A good beginning will sink its claws into a reader, and it won't let go even long after the book has been finished and put back up on the shelf. In the same token, a bad beginning will do the opposite. It'll sit like lead in their stomach until they put the book down, never having finished it. Volumes have been written on the importance of things like the opening line, but that's not really what I want to talk about today. Instead, I want to take a step back and I want to talk about something more fundamental. How do you actually start your story? When we go to start a story, we need to do a couple of things. First, we need to ground it in time. That is, we have to determine when we're going to start the story. Second, we have to figure out the pacing of it. And third, we need it to lead into something else. We need to know where it's going to go. So let's take each of these one at a time. First, let's talk about timing. The timing of an opening is really important. When does this story start? And this is a harder question to answer than you might actually think. For example, take my story as an author. Did my story start when I quit my job and I started writing full time? Or did it start when I published my very first book? Or did my story as an author start when I started writing for the first time? Or how about when I picked up my very first book and started reading, setting me on the journey that would ultimately end where I am today? So how do we as writers decide when in our timeline we want to start our story? I think it's helpful to think about what you're trying to accomplish. Think about the micro story that you are trying to tell. What do I mean by a micro story? Well, if you took any person's life, any real person's life, you would realize that their story is actually made up of a lot of small stories, a lot of micro stories. And we can actually break that down even further. So if you say, I'm going to write a story about a rabbit who's hopping out of his home and he's going to buy some carrots at the store and he's going to return and he's going to have a grand adventure along the way, that story is not the entirety of his life. It is not everything he has ever experienced. It is just a piece of his life, a piece of what he has experienced. And it's also made up of smaller stories, little micro stories that we can tell as he opens his door, as he goes out and he encounters his first obstacle, as he overcomes that obstacle and encounters another obstacle after that. And so each of those encounters, each of those scenes is a micro story in and of itself. So this is what I want you to take away. It doesn't matter when in this whole process you start the story, as long as you are starting with one of these micro stories. Identify which micro story you want to lead off with or you want to tell first, and then just tell that one. Because you can always go back and add more before. If you're like, you know what, this just doesn't read right, there's not enough lead up to the big climactic scene where he finally overcomes the great obstacle and gets the carrot, you can just go back earlier and you can write what happened before that. You don't have to stress about it too much. You can just start. Now, if you're still confused about, okay, Seth, but where do I actually start? One thing I like to do is I like to start my micro story immediately after the first problem reveals itself. This is sort of an aggressive way of telling a story, and I like it. But again, this is just total personal opinion, and other people have different ways of telling stories, and you might have your own way of telling a story. But if you're at a loss, try this. Think about the first micro story that you are going to tell, and then set the opening of your story immediately after your protagonist, the rabbit in this case, discovers the problem. It rained a lot last night. The river is higher than normal. I don't have a boat, and I'm not a very good swimmer. Our character has discovered this problem and is getting ready to face it, and maybe even reflecting a little bit on how he or she got to this point. Now, I wouldn't worry about giving backstory at the beginning, and I'm not saying you should start mid-action, but instead choose a nice, comfortable moment of pause where it feels natural that we as the observer have stepped into our role and are observing this story. You can do a lot with that moment of pause as you are sort of thinking about, as your character is thinking about and reflecting on the situation that they're currently in. And that brings us directly to the second issue of pacing. How quickly do we move through the opening of our story? Now, this is actually going to be really genre dependent, because in some genres, we have to move really quickly. We have to get to the problem and we have to present the solution, and then all of the tropes we're going to use are based around trying and failing or trying and succeeding in achieving the objective. But we know ahead of time what the objective is, and we know ahead of time how it's going to be solved. So a great example of a genre like that is a murder mystery. Imagine with me, we have a murder mystery where there isn't a dead body in the first chapter, or the second chapter, or the third chapter. Pretty soon people are going to start saying, wait a second, this isn't what I signed up for. This is something masquerading as a murder mystery maybe, but it's not really what I signed up for. If I'm sitting down to read a murder mystery, I want the trope, which is there is a problem, dead body, and there is a solution that is known, finding the killer. Now, what I'm interested in is just reading about how we try and fail or try and succeed at this task. But other genres treat this differently. An epic fantasy novel is going to take us on a grand adventure, and it might set up for a fair number of chapters the protagonist and their world, and then introduce the main problem, the main issue that they're going to try to solve. It might take us a longer time to get there, and that's okay. Again, different genres are going to treat this differently, and so know your genre, know what kind of story you're writing, because that's going to tell you what kind of pacing you need. Now, I will say, as a general rule, faster is better than slower. We want to keep our reader engaged, and the best way to keep them engaged is to move the story along. We don't want to drown them in exposition. We want to keep things fresh, keep introducing new ideas and new concepts. Now, if you're afraid, well, people won't have the context to know what's going on in this situation because I sort of just dropped them into the middle of it. Don't worry, trust your readers. Readers are smart. They pick up clues that sometimes we as writers didn't even intend to put down, but subconsciously we will add and we'll make our point. So trust your readers, stick to your genre trope, and that's going to give you a good sense of how you should pace the beginning of your story. All right, so third, what do we do once we've actually started? I know that this was a major issue for me, not knowing where to take my novel. Often my brain was so full of ideas and possibilities that it sort of introduced a bit of paralysis. I didn't actually know where to take my story, and that could be really tough. And so there was actually a period of my life as a writer where I would just write beginnings of stories. And I have, I think, like 15 or 20 of these things still sitting on my Google Drive somewhere. And I've never done anything with them because I just couldn't figure out where to take them after I had opened. I had this cool opening scene and I would start it and I would try and I just didn't know what to do with it. Over time, though, I have developed a method for dealing with this specific issue. What I've learned to do is narrow my scope. Instead of focusing on the grand story that I'm trying to tell, that is the overarching story, instead, I narrow. I bring my vision very tight to just deal with that initial problem, or at least set up that initial problem. So do you remember when we were talking a little bit earlier about how you can determine the micro story that you're going to tell, and you can use that as a sort of an indicator of where you should be starting your story time-wise? Well, if you focus on that and you narrow the scope to just that, don't think about what should come next. Think about, what does my character have to do right now in this moment? And as soon as you do that, as soon as you figure out what your character has to do in that moment, you naturally set up this chain reaction for what needs to come next. And every good scene has its own story embedded within it. And at the end of it, you have your connector, your transition, the way that your character gets to the next scene. Now, this could be an emotional transition. It could be a physical transition if they're actually moving to a place. It could be introducing a new character who's going to link you in to the events of the next scene. It can be all sorts of different things. But once you know what your character has to achieve in that opening scene, and you don't worry about all of the other pieces setting up everything else, you can just sort of naturally progress through. Deal with the problem in front of you, or rather in front of your character, and they'll naturally end up where they need to go. This completely removes all of this sort of stress of having to make sure that your opening is properly setting up the rest of the book. Because as long as you naturally progress through your scenes, you're going to be able to set up those scenes in a way that will bring everything together. You don't have to worry about it right at the beginning. So again, if you don't know where to go, then just try narrowing your focus. Try focusing on writing the scene that's directly in front of you and dealing with the problems that your character has to deal with right now. It goes without saying that all of these are subjective methods. They're methods that have worked for me over time, and I hope you can get some use out of them. But don't follow them too rigidly. One of the things I've been realizing is that when we lock ourselves into the way other people tell us to write or the way other people tell us to do creative things, sometimes we can create a bit of a problem for ourselves, a stumbling block, because not everybody writes the same way. We don't think the same way. We don't tell stories the same way. And that's perfectly fine. There is no right way to do it. There is no perfect method for writing. Writing is a creative thing. It's a means of expressing who you are and how you see the world. And so lean into that. Try these methods. And if they work for you, fantastic. Adopt them for your own use. If they don't work for you, that's fine too. Hopefully you can glean some things, and through this process of trial and error, you're going to get better and better and better. And my hope for you is that you'll be able to avoid just staring blankly at the screen for hours on end, like I did when I was starting. Hopefully these tips help you start your stories in a smoother, cleaner way, and you can get right into telling the stories that only you can tell.